Unlike previous empires where the primary mechanism to project military power was conquest, the U.S. does it in a different way. The U.S. doesn't need conquest because it has access. The U.S. can project military power anywhere in the world because its allies and partners, they cooperate militarily with the United States by letting the U.S. military in. And so to the extent the U.S. wants to continue being a hegemon, it's going to need to keep hold of access.
This ability to project power for the systems that require it, so ground systems, relatively short-range systems, and so forth, right? This power projection capability, founded on our access to basing and overflight and so forth, right, separates us from everybody else. And this goes back to the fundamental point that, therefore, our allies ought to be invested in, nurtured, and taken care of in a way that recognizes that this gives us a geostrategic reach that China and Russia simply don't have.
Welcome to episode 159 of the Irregular Warfare Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Atwell. Today's episode examines the relationship between alliances like NATO, military access, and U.S. global power projection. To discuss this, I'm joined by two guests. Ambassador Doug Lute, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO and a retired U.S. Army three-star general, and Dr. Rachel Metz, an assistant professor at the George Washington University and co-author of the article this episode deep dives, titled Allies and Access: Implications of an American Turn Away from Alliances. The Irregular Warfare Podcast is a joint production of the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project at Princeton University and the Modern War Institute at West Point, dedicated to bridging the gap between scholars and practitioners to support the community of irregular warfare professionals. You can find many more resources at www.irregularwarfare.org. Last but not least, support for the Irregular Warfare Podcast comes from members of the IW community like you and from Hadean, an AI company focused on synthetic environments for training, planning, and decision support. Without further ado, here is today's conversation on alliances and wartime access. Ambassador Doug Lute, Dr. Rachel Metz, welcome to the Irregular Warfare Podcast.
Good to be with you.
Thank you for having me.
Today's episode focuses on an article you wrote, Rachel, titled Allies and Access: Implications of an American Turn Away from Alliances. I'd like to start the conversation by asking what motivated you to write this piece.
So public discussion of U.S. allies and partners, and whether it's comments by presidents and policymakers or media articles and scholarship, focus pretty much almost entirely on one form of military cooperation between allies, and that's burden sharing, and specifically defense spending in peacetime, and maybe what an ally or a partner sent or didn't send to Afghanistan. But there's another form of military cooperation that's just as, if not more, important, and that gets largely overlooked, and that's access. Decisions by states to let the U.S. military operate or fight from inside their borders. So I, along with my co-authors, it's Austin Carson and Paul Post, we wanted to broaden the conversation on what's at stake when we talk about alliances and partnerships, and just make the case that a systematic conversation requires attention, not just to this burden sharing in the form of defense spending or coalition contributions, but also access.
So that's your main motivation, is that you feel like the current national dialogue on the value of our allies is essentially not looking at the whole problem set right now.
No, it's percentages of GDP you're spending on defense, whether it's 2.5 or 5%. It's caveats. Did you put what rules of engagements got in the way of the coalition in Afghanistan? And that leading to undervaluation of what allies and partners have done to help the United States with its security objectives.
And Rachel, this came out in November, right? Which struck me because since it came out, we've had this sort of classic case study of access with regard to the ongoing war in the Persian Gulf region. And it actually separated out some of the other variables, so there was considerably little burden sharing, except with Israel, right? But not with our NATO allies. But access became a real linchpin to the whole operation.
Yeah, absolutely. It felt timely to me. And then Operation Epic Fury started. And where is the U.S. Air Force flying from? It's flying from inside the Gulf. Where are replenishment ships that are keeping the aircraft carriers on station going to? They're going to ports, not in CONUS. So, wartime access was what made Operation or Epic Fury possible, for better and for worse, depending on your perspective. And so, yeah, absolutely. Wartime access is once you see it, it's the air we breathe, and it's the sort of secret sauce behind all the wars the U.S. military fights.
Well, part of the title is Implications of an American Turn Away from Alliances. Are we actually seeing a meaningful erosion of America's alliance networks today? And what are the indicators if that's true?
Well, I think this is still an open question. I don't think we can be definitive on this today. It's clear that alliance structures are in transition. And so while this transition is underway, it's perhaps premature to say where it's going to end up. But I think some of the themes in the ongoing transition is allies are picking up a greater responsibility for their own security. So this is sort of the burden transition dimension of what's going on. And the second is, and in part the cause for this, is that they sense a pretty persistent message from the United States that we are no longer as interested in leadership of these alliances. And perhaps we're not even as interested in the underlying commitments on which the alliances are based. So this is all underway. We'll see. I mean, we're taping this podcast a week out from the next data point, which will be the Ankara summit, the NATO summit next week. So July 7 and 8, we'll have another point. But it's clear that things are shifting.
You were the ambassador to NATO in the aughts. Was it 2013 and 2017? Is that correct?
That's right. 13 to 17. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, did you observe increasing tensions or potential fractures in the alliance at that point, or did things seem on a pretty steady footing? Was this even a question at that point?
Well, look, in 2013, I went to NATO as the U.S. ambassador, having retired from the military, and thought, what could possibly go wrong in NATO? And this would be this would be a great job to sort of transition into my last chapter of my life. And I had started my Army career in NATO, but that was all the way back in the midst of the Cold War. So I thought, it comes with a nice house. This would be a pretty sweet job. After the first 6 months there, Putin seized and illegally annexed Crimea. He destabilized the Donbass by supporting these so-called Ukrainian separatist groups. And in that following summer, this guy named al-Baghdadi went to the mosque in Mosul and declared the physical caliphate across northern Iraq and northern Syria. So what I thought would be Sleepy Hollow turned out to be a very policy-oriented, exciting job for nearly 4 years.
So you're saying you showed up and within a year, everything fell apart. Interesting.
I have been occasionally I've caught myself being self-conscious about this, right? Wondering why is it that this happens when I go someplace? But it turned out to be really exciting. And the basic answer to your question, Kyle, is that I think those external challenges to the alliance, first to the east and then later to the south with ISIS, really coalesced the alliance in a way that maybe it hadn't been for some time. So things were really quite cohesive, quite coherent, and the sense of U.S. leadership was clear and unquestioned.
Taking a look at the role that allies and partners are playing in Operation Epic Fury, we're seeing some restrictions on U.S. access that suggest maybe some data points towards an erosion of U.S.'s network of allies and partners. And maybe we can't take for granted that our allies and partners will let us fight wars from inside their borders anymore. So, we have Turkey. We're familiar with Turkey denying us access. It's not the first time, but I don't see a lot of U.S. Air Force operations from Turkey for the Iran war. But, we're seeing Spain denying access and France and Italy. And that strikes me as something a bit new. I mean, it's not unprecedented. For Operation El Dorado Canyon back in 1986, Libya, there was a denial of overflight rights to Spain and Portugal. So, but seeing these kind of stalwart traditional U.S. allies place restrictions on the U.S. military operations in this war that we're seeing the U.S. fight right now, that to me suggests that we can't take for granted that wartime access is going to continue as it has in the past.
Well, I think in particular, though, just to put a bit of an edge on that point, Rachel, we cannot take for granted Allied support, especially when we don't consult them. And we cannot take for granted Allied support in what they reasonably view, I think, as a war of choice. For those who say, well, why didn't NATO come to the fore here? They're a little behind in the reading. They need to reread the Washington Treaty that makes clear that NATO's a defensive alliance and not an offensive alliance. So there's some good reasons that allies are perceived and actually came up short by way of at least the measurement of this White House.
So what would you say to, the average listener who doesn't think about this constantly when they hear leadership say that NATO allies are letting us down right now because they're abandoning us. How do you explain that to them in layman's terms, that that's not necessarily the case?
Well, each of the allies that are typically mentioned that Rachel outlined, right, first of all, did this on a national basis. And our bases in these allied states or our requests for overflight rights are done on a bilateral nation-to-nation basis. So first of all, it's not really a NATO issue. They happen to be NATO allies, but first and foremost, they're nation states, right? So in each of the instances, this was a national decision. And I think the factors I mentioned, so lack of consultation, lack of prior consultation, and the fact that this was viewed as an offensive war, not a war justified by sort of preventive war theory, that those factors were strong in dictating the response of these individual allies. And then I think it's also, even, as a former NATO ambassador, I was reminded that each of the cases where U.S. access was restricted was very much a reflection of the domestic politics of that ally, right? So the cases across Spain and France and Italy are very different. But, when you have democracies as allies, you must expect that national decisions are going to be pressed through the domestic political democratic lens. And I think that's what we got. So there's some real value in having democratic allies, but it also, I think, poses a somewhat higher bar in terms of domestic support for actions that those body politics perhaps perceive as unjustified and unwarranted.
So to push back a little bit on the doom and gloom about the future and strength of the alliances, when you said, Doug, that external threats can coalesce the alliance, as has happened a couple of times in your tenure, it makes me think that, well, some people say, NATO is falling apart right now. At the same time, we just added a couple new members in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which seems like a strengthening of the alliance. I think you need to look at the whole picture there and maybe not
That's
just
right.
caught in the headlines. But the other thing I would ask is if there is tension within NATO, but we're not just talking about NATO, we're talking about just with allies in general. This is something you brought up in your paper, Rachel, is that it could be caused by a couple things. It could be caused by individual political leaders. It could be that, Donald Trump does not prefer alliances. He prefers unilateral. Or it could actually reflect deeper changes in the international system. Could you explain that a little bit? And then I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what the most prominent reasons are to explain any tensions we're experiencing now or even in the past.
Yeah, I think the question of why do states sometimes let the U.S. fight wars from inside their borders, why do they sometimes deny or restrict it, is a really important one. So I'll say a few things. So one, it looks to me as if the primary reason states do tend to grant access to the U.S. is they view the U.S. as a state that will advance their security objectives. Aligning with a superpower is usually a good idea. Maybe the superpower will then invest in your defense, come to your defense if you're attacked, invest in your military infrastructure. And often, to Doug's point, the reason not to grant access to the U.S. is domestic political headwinds that you might face for letting the U.S. in and operate visibly. So often what you'll see is states whose leadership view their, the security interests in granting access, but the domestic politics is pushing against. And then what you'll see is placing, really restrictions on the visibility of the U.S. footprint in the theater. So lowering the number of troops in the theater. It has to be logistics and not combat operations, overflight, because that's hard to see. Just emphasis on restricting the visibility. The primary reason to grant the U.S. access is because states view it as in their security interest to do that. But there are some trajectories that might start to push that in the opposite direction. And so one is if the balance of power is changing, and the U.S. no longer, offers the security that only the U.S. can offer. If states can look to other security partners to provide security, they might see less of a strategic interest in letting the U.S. in. The other is the retaliation risk. So states make their alignment decisions based on what makes them more secure. And so if, letting the U.S. fight wars from inside their borders leads to retaliation against them that the U.S. can't protect them from, then that could lead states to start to shut their doors. And that would have less to do with this administration and more to do with changes in technology, like the proliferation of drones and cheap missiles and the difficulty of defending against them.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Doug's thoughts because I think it's an incredibly important question. I think there are some people who believe strongly in alliances, are concerned about the current state of alliances, but say, well, hey, this is because this current administration doesn't support it, but things will get better. But if it's actually systemic changes driving this, then it may not matter as much. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Doug.
Well, I do think another transition which is occurring is that power is becoming more dispersed in the international system. As good Americans, we're accustomed to the last sort of 25 or 30 years where basically we were without competition on the international scene. So when you press that geostrategic reality across Rachel's argument, it was pretty easy to align with us. There was no competition. And now I think states see that China is emerging as especially an economic and political competitor on the global scene. The U.S. is, on the other hand, is perceived as stepping back a bit. This isn't only, by the way, the Trump administration. This is broader than the Trump administration because there was some stepping back with previous administrations as well. And then I think that, especially in Europe, it's really sunk in that they have an aggressive, unpredictable, neo-imperialist neighbor and that they've got to contend with Russia, the Russia they have. And certainly the 2022 invasion of Ukraine made that obvious. So there are a number of things going on in and around this policy question about health of alliances and so forth that I think explain some of what's going on. Going forward, I think the war with Iran example, that case study, will further amplify this caution before allies quickly align just because the U.S. is doing something. And that's because of the consequences of this war, which affected the global economy, the global energy supply, and so forth. And those effects are likely to persist, even though we have some form of a ceasefire today. It seems a bit of a misnomer. But even if there were a full ceasefire and the strait completely open, the global impacts of this war will be felt by many of our allies, perhaps for a year or more. So I think that they'll be somewhat reinforced in the view that, it makes sense to sort of measure this twice before, and only cut it once before deciding to align with the U.S.
Thinking about this broader question about is the shift in power in the international system driving our alliance behavior, both of your answers were essentially how other people would want to align with us more or less. But given the system power shift argument, if there's a rising China and a more active Russia, it seems like the U.S.'s reaction should be to do the same thing. It should actually be to build more allies because they're losing relative power in the international system rather than moving away from allies. So it's kind of interesting. It doesn't really nest into that systemic approach.
Especially at this time of global transition, right? We should be doubling down with our alliance structures. We have, if anything, taken our alliances for granted for a long time. And I think that in the face of this transition in the global power structure, we should be reminded that perhaps our single greatest geostrategic advantage over potential competitors or actual competitors like Russia and China, right, is our constellation of allies. Russia and China have nothing to compare to our cast of allies, both in Europe and in Asia. I'm reminded of this occasionally when Putin's key regional ally, Lukashenko of Belarus, visits Moscow or something. That's kind of the equivalent of Trump next week flying to Ankara to meet with 31 NATO allies and 4 additional NATO partners, many of whom from Asia are also allies, right? So, just paint these two pictures. You've got Putin and Lukashenko side by side, and you got Trump in the family photo of the NATO summit with 32 allies standing together strong. To your basic point, Kyle, we should be doubling down on this because it's a huge advantage that our competitors cannot match.
I will add just the U.S. does have a choice. It does not have to project global military power. The U.S. could decide that its appetites are reduced. The U.S. could focus on specific areas and not all areas. What wartime access does is it makes any state in the world the U.S.'s next door neighbor. It makes it possible for the U.S. to project military power everywhere it wants to, whenever it wants, for as long as it wants. But I think as we've recently seen, that could be a blessing or a curse. And the U.S. might not actually benefit from such easy projection of military power anywhere it wants, whenever it wants. And so to Doug's point about, allies making choices not to facilitate a war that they didn't think, that they thought was offensive, that wasn't a just war, wartime access restrictions, allies saying no to certain things the U.S. might like to do might not be the end of the world either. And there's an a priori strategic question of what does the U.S. want to do with its military all over the world? And only after answering that question can we answer questions about what's at stake when it comes to an erosion of alliance network and generally, and then access in particular.
But the reality the global reality is that our economies are so intertwined that we really don't have much of a choice here. We can't sort of pick and choose where we're going to engage and when we're not. I mean, we are the predominant global economy largely on the basis of economic access, which is underpinned by military security access, right? So if you peel this back away from the security dimension and overlay it on top of the economic map, I think, again, the Iran war demonstrates just how interconnected we are. And while the U.S. doesn't actually import much oil from the Persian Gulf region, when the Strait of Hormuz is closed, we're paying $4.50 a gallon at the pump. And that just, for every American, that should be a reminder that this starts with economic prosperity and setting aside the potential for a physical threat to the United States, which frankly, in 250 years, we haven't had many of those, right? Most of our military power projection is really underpinning our economic prosperity.
I don't know, Doug. I was just at the White House Museum this last weekend, and I saw a picture of a burnt White House from the Brits back in the day. So I guess we have some physical threats. But
but the good news is that was what, like 1812 or something, and that's the last time.
So, and to be fair to any leadership that are engaging on burden sharing conversation with allies, it's hard to tell if it's a negotiating tactic. They're invested in the alliance, but they just want to see increases in burden sharing, or if it's actually a genuine push away from alliances. So that's hard to decipher. I do want to get into Rachel's main argument about access and define what it is and the implications. But before we do that, Rachel, we do know some things about alliances based on the current corpus of academic literature. If you could just go over briefly, what are the benefits in the current literature about why people join alliances, and what are some of the costs within alliances?
Sure. So existing research on alliance dynamics, so the most basic story of alliances is alliances are to pool resources to combat a shared threat. And then under periods of multipolarity in particular, states externally balance against adversaries. Essentially, they form alliances to pool their capabilities to deter an adversary, or if they have to fight them and defeat them. So just thinking about the classic...
This isn't like a recent history. This is like going back to the Peloponnesian War and how states thousands of years ago fought against each other.
Yeah, though I'd say a lot of the IR scholarship is pretty oversampled on World War I and World War II in particular. So I'm thinking about, Kenneth Waltz, Stephen Wald, Glenn Snyder, et cetera. And so the main benefits, why form alliances? It's better to pool your capabilities than to fight alone. You can improve your balance of power relative to an adversary, so you can bolster deterrence and then fight more effectively. There's also pretty interesting literature on asymmetric alliances. So why would the U.S. seek junior partners in a war? And most of the scholarship has come to the consensus that it's not for benefits on the battlefield, because in fact, fighting with junior partners just complicates everything. There's some nuances there, but dealing with caveats and interoperability issues and languages, and it's just a mess. And so the real purpose... Yeah, so the real reason that the U.S. wants to bring allies into a coalition is for legitimacy, is to say, we're not doing this alone. Look at all of the partners that we're bringing to this fight with us, and that confers legitimacy on the battlefield. And so, so those are some of the benefits that the scholarship recites about working with allies. So the downsides, the big three are entrapment. An ally could get you into a fight that you don't want to be in. Abandonment, an ally might not come to your aid after all. And then the cousin of abandonment is this burden sharing, unequal burden sharing, or the free riding concern. So this is the Olson and Zeckhauser argument that security in alliance is a public good, in the sense that each state in an alliance has an interest in doing as little as possible, but getting the benefit of the alliance. And so what you see junior partners in particular do is free ride on the security provided by the stronger states in the system. Those are the literature, the big few.
So a couple thoughts. One on the entrapment question, right? I think that when all the way back in 1948 and early months of 1949, when the NATO treaty was being drafted here in Washington, right? It's called the Washington Treaty, right? It's very interesting. When they got to the collective defense clause of the NATO treaty, so the famous Article 5, right? An attack on one is considered an attack on all. The authors considered this entrapment issue. I don't know if they did it with full awareness, because they inserted in Article 5 the clause that an attack on one shall be considered as an attack on all, and each ally will respond according to its own national processes. In other words, there's no automaticity to an attack on a NATO ally. It's not as though we're at war, or that we have to send troops. Is that second part in
small print, though, or is it the same size print?
No, it's a clause. No, it's people don't read this carefully, right? So they've got to go to the source documents, right? And so Article 5 has essentially an escape clause to prevent this automatic entrapment that is often perceived as a potential downside of the alliance. So in a practical case, if a NATO ally were attacked, all that's triggered is a meeting in the White House Situation Room for national command authority figures to figure out what the U.S. response should be. There's no automatic military response. It might be we might issue a démarche. We might have a press conference. So there is this concern about entrapment, but it's actually accounted for in the NATO treaty.
As Rachel said earlier, a lot of the debate you see publicly has to do with the burden sharing part. Essentially, why are we spending more than our allies are? Is this equal? Is it fair? But what you just listed, Rachel, was various benefits and then also other downsides. Why do you think we get over-focused in the national dialogue on the burden sharing part? Is it just that much more important? Or is there something about it that stands out while the other arguments don't get the time they need?
I do think it's important. I think we're focusing on it too much, but that's not to say that free riding isn't a problem and that burden sharing isn't important. So I do think that there is some there, and that's part of why we see an emphasis on paying their fair share. But I also think it's very measurable and very visible. And it's easy to talk a lot about things that are measurable and visible, especially when they jive with American sentiment, a direction going on, in public opinion towards kind of pulling back a bit, shifting some of our expenditure from overseas to at home. So I think there are good reasons to focus on paying their fair share and burden sharing. And I also think there are some other less persuasive reasons to focus on it.
The burden sharing debate, though, the conventional narrative here is that we're getting ripped off, right? We're being taken advantage of, the free riders in the NATO alliance and so forth. But, to some extent, if you get deeply into the data, we've actually propelled this argument. So, for example, when NATO compares defense spending, typically among the 32 allies, we simply tally up the defense budgets, right? And for the vast majority of especially the European allies, their defense budgets are very much aligned with NATO capabilities. They don't have global responsibilities. On the other hand, the U.S. defense budget includes vast quantities that have almost nothing to do with NATO. So all those forces committed to the Indo-Pacific region, national capital expenses like our space-based capabilities, our nuclear deterrent, command and control, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, we'd have those even if we didn't have the NATO alliance. So we're not exactly comparing apples to oranges here because we have responsibilities and therefore we have defense capabilities that none of the other allies have. And yet we count all of those American expenditures when we say that the burden sharing is unfair.
I have a maybe slightly more pessimistic theory, which is that it's just easy and most of the American public doesn't really follow. I think if you were like, well, let me explain to you about burden sharing and realism and balance of power and China's this and that, be like, and then the other side is like, let me show you the dollar amount on a bar graph of how much we spend. And it's just a little easier to sell the second point than the first one.
But it conveniently fits the populist narrative, which is just, a list of grievances and we're being ripped off and this is unfair and I've had enough of this, right? And this is not a narrative that's pointed just to Washington, D.C. It's a global phenomenon where central governments are hearing from their people that the people don't believe, voting publics often don't believe that they're getting a fair shake. And it's not just the U.S.
Rachel, your paper argues that we've overlooked one of the most important benefits of alliances in the academic literature, which is this idea of access. So what is allied-enabled access and why does it matter so much?
Sure. So access refers to decisions by states to allow other states' military intelligence services to operate from inside their borders, on their land, in their territorial waters, or through their airspace in peacetime or in wartime. And states can fully grant access, they can restrict it, or they can deny it. And it matters a huge amount because it's what facilitates the projection of U.S. military power all over the world. And it's a ubiquitous form of military cooperation between the U.S. and its allies and partners. It's a vital one, and yet it's one that's almost entirely overlooked in these public discussions of burden sharing that we've been talking about. And a lot of the pretty much all the academic scholarship on alliances and burden sharing and coalitions too. If not, I do think there's much more attention to this among military professionals.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that because when I read this paper, as a military person who thinks about access all the time, I was like, well, of course access matters. And it's interesting, I was wondering if is this just an academic gap, which happens, things that we know, everybody knows is common sense, it just hasn't been proven in academia. But you make up an interesting point that it's not just in academia, it's in our public discourse. We don't really talk about this. So military professionals and national security experts may think about this, but it's not part of our general conversation, I think is what you're saying.
I would also say that I've been in a number of war games where we don't play green, where we hold green constant, where we write in green's decisions into the game and don't vary them as part of the game. So what I mean by that
green,
is
you mean the ally, right?
I mean the allies and partners,
Yeah.
yes. So, I don't, although I do think that there's much more emphasis on access among military professionals, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's getting the attention that it should in those same circles. To use the war game jargon, I think we've got to play green. Allies, we need to step into these games and think, what would happen if that access we assume we get, we don't actually get. But I do think, to your point, I do think part of this is a translation exercise. I think part of this is taking the emphasis on access that military planners think about and bringing it to an academic space and to the public space, which I do think there are a lot of reasons to do that. And one of them is because it raises questions that I don't think military planners and policymakers have answers to. So like what explains states' decisions to grant, restrict, or deny access? By moving this conversation to the scholarly domain, to academics, we can also move the ball forwards in ways that then will bring insights back to the policymaking community. Even if they already know that access matters, they might not know what causes it.
I think there's an interesting intersection between access and burden sharing. Because in many cases, allies assume a burden when they allow our basing, right? So allies, both in the Pacific and in Europe, often give us basing rights and so forth that include benefits like, no rent, support for dual purpose civilian infrastructure to that base, and so forth. And perhaps we don't fully take account of the burdens that allies assume when they in fact grant us an advantage, which is access. Think Ramstein Air Base, for example. I mean, we could not replace that. And the Germans pay a large proportion of the infrastructure support costs for granting us access on their sovereign territory.
I'd also just add, I completely agree with you, Doug. I think the Gulf states would say they're bearing a burden in the war in Iran. So I think expanding our definition of what burden sharing is, it can be much more costly to let your state become part of the battlefield than even to send troops to a contingency far away. I mean, opening up your doors to let the U.S. fight a war from inside your borders can be enormously costly, just in terms of retaliation and also domestic politics. But what we're seeing in the war in Iran is real burden being borne by states that are cooperating.
And I think one of the likely strategic consequences of the war in Iran are those Gulf partners are going to reconsider the burden that they're paying or the price they're paying for U.S. bases. And those U.S. bases simply can't be moved outside the range of Iranian offensive systems. So this is, I think, the whole question of burden on behalf of our Gulf partners is a lot clearer today than it was sort of 4 months ago.
Yeah, this threat of retaliation, one of the things I was thinking about while reading your paper, Rachel, is that I wonder if the threat of retaliation for providing access is actually increasing due to the ability of states to conduct sophisticated asymmetric attacks due to technological changes. I think you talk a little bit about how during the global war on terror period, states opened themselves up to terrorist attacks in their territory, but now through cyber attacks, through sabotage, as I think we've seen Russia conduct across Europe in response to Europe's support of Ukraine. And then, of course, we're seeing what the ability of drones and other technologies can do for Iran. Do you have any feelings on whether retaliation is actually a greater threat for states now?
I think their war in Iran is showing that it is. And I think Doug made the point earlier. I think we're going to see states consider carefully in the future what they're going to do because of these changes in technology. So the U.S. couldn't protect the Gulf states from barrages of drones and missiles. I mean, it could help, but they got through and at enormous cost. And so I do think that we are going to see, some increasing reticence by partners to take on the costs of retaliation if the technology makes it so that the U.S. can't protect them from it.
And Kyle, the point you made about asymmetric attacks, I think this really highlights the fact that offensive systems, so relatively cheap drones and even ballistic missiles and so forth, that can overwhelm relatively expensive defensive systems, think the PAC-3 Patriot, for example, really amplifies this potential cost for partners who are willing to host bases. So I'll be interested in the coming years, and it probably will take years to play out, how willing our Gulf partners are to host Al Udeid Air Base and bases in Kuwait and the Emirates and Bahrain. So all of which were struck in the last couple months by way of Iranian assets, which were relatively cheap.
It's the reactions aren't just going to be restricted to the Gulf states. I'd be pretty curious to see how Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines are looking at what happens if you let the U.S. fight from inside your borders. The U.S. is negotiating for base access in the Philippines and operational plan. The U.S. plans to fight. If the U.S. is going to defend Taiwan, it's probably not going to do it only from Guam and the Northern Marianas. And so, other states, not just the Gulf states, are watching this war and thinking through, what costs they might incur, what burdens they might bear if they were to let the U.S. fight from inside their borders.
Especially if you add on top of the vulnerability argument, the fact that, we may not be able to count on the U.S., right? So even if we count on the U.S. and the U.S. delivers, it won't be 100% effective. Witness the Persian Gulf ally experience. But I think that is even amplified if you can't count on the U.S. in the first place.
I'm going to go back to the Russia response to European support for Ukraine, because I think when we think about the ways that Russia might retaliate, we think about, they might do a conventional invasion of the Baltics, or there could be a nuclear response. But actually, most of the retaliation we've seen have been more in the irregular warfare space. It's been things that are plausibly deniable, things that are much lower visibility. And so, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Doug, as somebody who served at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Do we proactively consider the full range from what you've seen of all these escalation measures, including in the difficult to account for and plausibly deniable space, or do we get over-focused on conventional threats?
I do think we sort of watch the shiny object here, right? We get fixated on a land invasion or the seizing of Narva, Estonia, or, some sort of NATO space that has a common border with Russian territory. But to your point, much more important, I think, in terms of both NATO vulnerabilities and available Russian assets is this gray zone, this zone of hybrid warfare tactics. So as you described, these are meant to be difficult to attribute, meant to confuse and distort the public narrative and delay response. And so what are we talking about? We're talking about election interference, misinformation campaigns, disruption of undersea cables, sabotage, even assassination. And this campaign has been going on across Europe. And by the way, the 2016 election results there was at least a Russian attempt to probe our electoral process in 2016. So allies, I think, NATO allies are increasingly aware of this, but still having difficulty, I think, coming to grips with how to counter a hybrid attack. And some of this is because it doesn't necessarily fall purely into the military realm. NATO is a military alliance. Responsibility here for these sorts of attacks fall across the boundary, drift across the NATO, European Union boundary, inside nation states. Responsibility falls not only in ministries of defense, but ministries of interior and so forth. So it gets very confusing. And of course, that's the design feature of these hybrid attacks, to press the boundaries, to confuse, to obfuscate, to delay, and so forth. So it's really a quite effective sort of economy of force measure by opponents like Russia, who are not prepared, and I think in the case of Russia, not right now capable of a significant conventional military threat, but it's a very effective tactic in terms of keeping us busy, keeping us disoriented, and busy examining ourselves.
I sometimes think we take for granted how incredibly difficult it is to project power around the world, to be anywhere we want very, very quickly with overwhelming force. And something that your paper highlighted was it's pretty simple concepts on their own, but when you tie them to access, makes a lot of sense. You talk about the tyranny of distance, the stopping power of water, and just the basic need to do logistics. And that's why access matters. But if you could, I'll give you one more salvo at convincing us that access is important and how it works, and then we can go to the final part of the conversation.
All right. In a nutshell, my pitch is that wartime access makes any state in the world the U.S.'s next door neighbor. And so what I mean by that, you think about where the wars the US has fought just in the last year, but then zooming back to 1945, the US has fought in Iraq several times, Iran, Libya, all over the world. And as Americans, we often take for granted that of course, the US can do this, but there is no of course to that. There's this thing, it's called the tyranny of distance, but I actually think the better frame for this is the loss of strength gradient. This is Kenneth Boulding's 1962 book, Conflict and Defense. Tyranny of distance is, it has a much better ring to it, but the loss of strength gradient is actually more on the money when it comes to the concept that military power declines the further you go from a nation's home territory for a couple reasons. So one of them is that weapon systems have range limitations. You can't shoot a gun from Konus and hit a target in Tehran. You have to get your short-range weapon systems into theater. And then the bigger reason is that modern militaries require a ton of stuff to keep them in the fight. Where there's tooth, there needs to be tail. Modern militaries consume huge amounts of fuel. They go through tons of ammunition. Everything needs spare parts and maintenance. Service members may need medevac, medical evacuation. So all of that means that not only do you need to bring all of your short-range weapon systems into the fight, you need to bring a huge amount of the sustainment necessary, also proximate to the fight, to be able to keep that tooth going over time. And the longer the supply lines are from the front to those supply depots in the back, the harder it all is. And I'll just give a pitch for Ryan Baker, a GW PhD, who wrote a really good dissertation on this. So it's hard. It's really hard to fight far away and fight anywhere in the world. And so how does the US do this? Through a mix of strategies. So one of them is, we often forget, but the US has a pretty big non-contiguous empire. So Guam, Andersen Air Force Base. The US has acquired territories that help the US project power far away. Second, aircraft carriers, naval aviation, floating bases that you don't need permission to operate. But actually you do need wartime access, so to keep an aircraft carrier on station, how do you do that? You've got replenishment ships that have to go get access from partner states to the ports to be able to then go and keep those ships on station. And then long-range weapon systems. So yes, there are long-range weapon systems that we can, send from Guam or from the continental United States all the way over. But there are some limitations on what you can achieve with long-range weapon systems. And then second, a lot of those systems also end up, secretly requiring access along the way. So the tankers that support bombers might land at bases on the route. Maybe the bombers will touch down and recover at a partner base before they make the long trip home. So all this to say that the U.S.'s ace in the hole, the secret sauce behind the projection of U.S. military power anywhere at any time for as long as it wants is wartime access. So to bring this full circle back to the pitch in a nutshell, wartime access mitigates this loss of strength gradient and brings every state in the world next door to the U.S.
Rachel, I can't believe you used the E word on the podcast, empire.
What's the
I think it might be. I actually never heard the U.S. described as a non-contiguous empire. I love that. But sorry, go ahead, Doug.
Daniel Immerwahr's got a book called How to Hide an Empire that I recommend.
But back to where we started this conversation, this ability to project power for the systems that require it, so ground systems, relatively short-range systems, and so forth, right? This power projection capability, founded on our access to basing and overflight and so forth, right, separates us from everybody else. And this goes back to the fundamental point that therefore our allies ought to be invested in, nurtured, and taken care of in a way that recognizes that this gives us a geostrategic reach that China and Russia simply don't have. I mean, Rachel's right. There are some relatively high-tech systems that defy geography. Space-based systems, cyber, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay, well, that's reasonably limited, right, in terms of utility. Long-range bombers now, we've all been amazed by the reach from bases in Missouri to Tehran and Iranian nuclear sites. But that's a pretty small subset of all the capabilities required to actually produce a lasting geopolitical impact with military power. So geography still counts. And getting there is really the first and frankly, in many ways, most difficult part of launching a campaign.
The aspect of access I think is really interesting is the relationship between the sort of military technical requirements, like literally to put a bomb onto that space, we would need to have a piece of ground in another country to be able to make that reach. And then how that ties to our broader foreign policy and whether we need allies. That goes, as you said, like way beyond the concept of burden sharing as just a dollar number. So the last question I want to go into before we get into our closing remarks is, Rachel, your paper makes a striking claim, which is that ally-enabled access has underpinned American global power since 1945. How are alliances, access, and U.S. hegemony connected? I think we're teasing on this, but you're making a clear link between our ability to have access and U.S. global hegemony.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the conversation we were just having starts to get to this. It's hard to project military power far away, and yet the U.S. does so every single day. It's hard to sustain large-scale combat operations over time far away, and yet the U.S. has done that dozens of times since 1945. And unlike previous empires, and I do consider the US a flavor of empire, unlike previous empires where the primary mechanism to project military power was conquest, the US does it in a different way. The US doesn't need conquest because it has access. The US can project military power anywhere in the world because its allies and partners, and sometimes states that it just asks to let it in, for out of the blue, not even a state you would consider a partner, because they cooperate militarily with the United States by letting the US military in. And so to the extent the US wants to continue being a hegemon, and I think that should be a live debate. I don't think we need to necessarily take as our starting point that the US should and must remain hegemon. But if the US does want to remain a hegemon, it's going to need to keep hold of access. So the pitch essentially is the US has been a hegemon since 1945, and it's been a military hegemon because other states have cooperated with the US by allowing the US to project military power from inside their borders.
Why would states agree to this? Why allow us bases? Why, beyond allow us, why sponsor our basic? It's because it's in those states' fundamental interest. I mean, for the reasons that Rachel lays out. And I think that, when you go from basing rights across the threshold to formal alliances, you might ask, well, why do we need formal alliances? Why can't we just sort of make it up as we go on an ad hoc basis and get basing rights or overflight rights when we need to? Well, we'll always be doing some of that ad hoc. But allies give us some predictability in terms of which bases under which conditions will be reasonably available. It gives us a starting point for operations in the planning phase so that we can begin then to lay out a military campaign plan. And without that predictability, if we were starting from scratch with no basing rights, no allied mechanisms, processes, consultation arrangements, and so forth in place, we'd never get anywhere because all we do is talk about it.
I mean, I guess I agree, Doug, in part. I do think that having an institutional alliance certainly reduces the friction of, the access to diplomacy. But I guess my main reaction is I don't think we know what drives states to grant, restrict, or deny access. I don't think the research has been done. I think we see particular cases of yeses and nos and restrictions. We see surprises. We see allies that we thought were going to go for it and let us through, then deny. Jordan shocked us in Gulf One, and then Turkey turned around and shocked us in 2003. We got access to a lot of states around Afghanistan that we had never worked with, that we hadn't worked with in the past. We're not in that way. So I guess I would say, I think for me, the jury's out on what the drivers of access decisions are. And I've seen some cases where, you pick up the phone, you say, I'm going to invest in this, I'm going to lengthen your runways, and I'm going to invest in developing your base infrastructure. And that's enough to get a yes. And there's no long-term relationship that drove that choice. And other cases where there is a long-term,
you can essentially do transactional requirements rather than just investing in the long-term on the chance you might need it.
I think the word transactionality, that's like a poisonous word in Washington, right? To say transactional relationships is to say that that's the bad way of doing business. And the good way of doing business is long-term alliances built on trust. And I guess I would say, if we're interested in the outcome of access and focusing on that outcome, instead of just thinking, what do we think should cause that decision? And we think it should be a long-term alliance built on trust. There might empirically, maybe it's displeasing to us, but I think we're actually going to see plenty of transactionality helping to get some decisions to turn in a direction that we'd like. So I'd just say, stepping back, to me, this is an important researchable question. And I think we might find, yes, 70% of cases are really, the cases where we get yeses, it's really all about the long-term alliances built on trust, but we might see an important 20% or whatever percentage it is where it might be something that we find distasteful. It might be a payoff. And we have to be open empirically to that if what we're interested in is trying to figure out what drives these decisions.
Rachel, it sounds like your next book. I think, though, before you begin to write that book, it seems to me, while there may be question marks about the empirical evidence of what gets us to yes, right? That is the permission to base or overfly and so forth. I think there are fewer questions about what will give us a clear no. And one of the things that's clearly in the this isn't going to work category is surprise, ad hoc, transactional approach that allies or potential partners or potential grantors of access don't find in their interest, and they have not had time to consult or consider domestic consequences. So it seems to me what gets us to yes is maybe a harder thing to discern than what gets us to no. There's some clear things that are going to lead to no. And I think lack of consultation and the perception that there is no imminent threat and that this takes the potential grantor of access down a path that country cannot justify to its people are pretty clear no's.
We're talking about the difference between access in peacetime and then access during wartime. And then the question would be, during wartime, could you essentially buy access temporarily? But I think another thing that access in peacetime provides, which we haven't discussed, is just situational awareness. So when we lose our sensors and our boots on the ground and our presence around the world, we lose a lot of our intelligence and understanding of what's going on there as part of our preparation for a future conflict.
Yeah.
And then going beyond just what the access gets us, so the alliance obviously in itself gets us deterrence. Credibility of that alliance matters, but it gets you deterrence. And then also there's probably a bunch of issue linkage, which I think you brought up before, Rachel, where just the fact that your allies might lead to enhanced economic ties and other types of benefits just through the military component of statecraft.
Kyle, I think you're raising a really interesting point. So when I talk to kind of security cooperation folks, I'm often struck by an expectation that a lot of mil-mil diplomacy in peacetime will shape an access decision in wartime. That if we develop relationships in peacetime and the purpose is to gain access, then, if the scenario happens, well, we will have built mil-mil relationships that will help to ease the way to an access decision. And I think there's something in that, and then there's a problem in that. And the problem in that is that access is a head of state level decision, and it's not necessarily something that mil-mil diplomacy on the ground is going to shape. But to your point, where I think a lot of the access in peacetime and the security cooperation in peacetime plays a gigantic role is in increasing the value of operating from inside that state if they do end up giving it a yes. So if you're working with a partner, you're gonna have more situational awareness, like you were saying, and improve interoperability. You're gonna coordinate plans, and you're gonna invest in longer runways and hardened aircraft shelters and all of these things that, regardless of whether all of that working together in peacetime shapes the access decision that the head of state level might make, regardless of that, setting that aside, if that decision is a yes, well, then all of that work that you've done in peacetime will be much more valuable.
We are getting close on time right now, so I'm going to pivot to our final question, and I'll start with you, Rachel. What are the implications of this conversation for policymakers, practitioners, and scholars?
Well, we segued into it. I think one thing to keep in mind is states have the agency to grant, restrict, or deny access. We have to play green. We can't take for granted that we're going to get a yes. And so we have to focus on thinking, how will we get to a yes if we decide that we do need to project military power in a place that requires access? But I do want to take a step back, and I've hit this point earlier, but I do want to take a step back and say it also shouldn't be taken for granted that we need to project power all over the world. You don't need military access if you're trying to fight Mexico or Canada. Not that we should not be fighting Mexico or Canada. I'll just for the record, let's not fight
or Greenland.
Yeah, for the record, let's not fight our neighbors. But you don't need wartime access if your military ambitions are close to home. You need military access all over the world if your appetite is large, if you want to be a military hegemon, if you want to maintain the role that the U.S. plays in the world, which we may decide we very much want to do. And if we do make that decision, if we do want to maintain the ability to project power all over the place, then we are going to need allies. We are going to need partners. And the thing we're going to need them the most for might not be the thing we tend to focus on the most. It might not be defense spending. It might be permissions to operate from inside their borders.
So the only thing I'd add is that, beyond the question of the capacity to project military power wherever we want, whenever we want. Underpinning that capability is the economic argument. I mean, it's one thing to have power projection in the military sense for security threats, but candidly, we get an at-home security threat about every 50 years or so. I mean, okay, Pearl Harbor, got it. 9/11, got it. But what about all the space where we're not physically threatened? Day to day, the power projection capability in our basing structure and our alliances underpin our economic prosperity. Even if we withdrew all these bases and we said, look, we're just going to project power from the continental United States, we'd have economic interest because the global economy is global. As I think the Iran war again reminds us, we can't simply unwind that interconnection, that interdependence on the international economic scene. And it comes by way of the energy market, it comes by way of critical minerals, it comes by way of marketplaces and so forth. So if we want an America that is prosperous, we should at least have the capability to defend ourselves forward. And not simply because there's an immediate security risk. There was no immediate security risk from Iran on American power, but because there's an economic argument as well. So what should ring true with Americans, every American, is the economic underpinnings of what we do overseas by way of markets and access to resources and so forth. And that's why we have a defense budget the size that we have.
Well, Ambassador Doug Lute, Dr. Rachel Metz, this has been a great conversation. We went a little long, but it's because you are an outstanding guest. Thank you for coming on the Irregular Warfare Podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Irregular Warfare Podcast. If you like the show, please spread the word and consider sharing this episode with others. You can subscribe to the Irregular Warfare Podcast so you do not miss an episode. You can also engage with us on X, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and across many other platforms. If you found value in today's conversation, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us reach new audiences. Support for the Irregular Warfare Podcast comes from members of the IW community like you and from Hadean, an AI company focused on synthetic environments for training, planning, and decision support. And one last thing. What you heard in this episode are the views of the participants and do not represent those of West Point, Princeton University, the Irregular Warfare Initiative, or any agency of the U.S. or any other government. Thanks again for being part of this community, and we'll see you next time.